Few weeks since we talked contentious town hall meetings. This week, though, Lieutenant Governor Beckwith hosted one in Zionsville where at times he sparred with those in attendance. 21 Alive's John Wagner and political science professor Laura Wilson dive into that story and more for us tonight.
I know politicians like President Trump and others kind of broke the mold of, I think, what the kind of politician I grew up with, which was, the ever people-pleasing kind of person who would never pick a fight with somebody at a town hall. They would try and find a polite way to just state their case and kind of move on. But saying something like, if you shoot a remark my way, I might send it back your way. Is that kind of just part and parcel for how politicians behave in the public arena?
It's definitely a new breed. And I think some people find it really refreshing. I think it goes hand in hand with the idea of draining the swamp or having an outsider's perspective. People want someone that's going to be different, right? Voters, we've seen that, obviously. I think there's an attraction to having someone who's really authentic. That's a phrase that's probably overused, but oftentimes goes against what we stereotype as politicians not being authentic, right? They're just trying to please you. They're just trying to get your vote. They're just trying to sell you on themselves. And so there is like a component of that's really refreshing. I think people also see that as someone who's willing to fight, someone who's willing to stand up for them. They're standing up for themselves and what they believe. If they do that, they're willing to fight for you too. And that's certainly changed over time. Historically, that probably would have been a really bad way to go. I don't think that would have been effective at getting elected. But now a little bit of light antagonism, right? Showing that you're comfortable with conflict, that you're willing to take on haters. I do think there is an appeal in that now. And that's just how the public official / politician, in our perspective, our expectations of them have really changed.
There were topics of faith, of conspiracy theories, chemtrails, all kinds of things. Does any of that fall into the responsibilities of a lieutenant governor?
No, not really. Typically, the lieutenant governor is given the powers of tourism, of speaking on behalf of the governor. A lot of times we say just in state government in general that lieutenant governors seldom make good assistant governors because they're often interested in running for office someday in the future for themselves. And I could certainly see that interest from Beckwith. We've seen a history of lieutenant governors just nationwide, right, eventually run for the governor's office. And we saw that with the last lieutenant governor ran, ultimately lost to incumbent governor Mike Braun, but interested in that next step. So no, none of these things directly relate to his current office, but they do give voters, constituents, Hoosiers, introspection into who Micah Beckwith is, what he stands for, what he believes. And I would say typically voters don't understand the nuances of state government. They don't understand the exact roles and responsibilities of the lieutenant governor. So quite frankly, for voters, for people watching and listening, they probably care more about the person than the position itself. And I think that's definitely what you got out of the town hall too.
Another headline that I instantly thought I wanted to bounce this off of you and get your take on was the Qatari jet that could become the next Air Force One plane. It seemed like such a strange idea. I also spoke with somebody who is ex-military and said it's impossible from a security standpoint to clear that to hold the president. But what did you think of the implications of taking that plane from that government and making it possibly the next Air Force One?
The political optics are all wrong. There's no way you can spin that in a way that's acceptable or understandable. I thought it was, quite frankly, pretty wild. And I'm glad to hear from experts from a military perspective say, yeah, this isn't really feasible, because that's not my expertise. But as a public opinion expert and looking in terms of what this would mean, what this would say, it's not that our country doesn't produce high quality aircraft, that we don't have strong military intelligence and the capability to do so. So it feels like a slap in the face to many American consumers, producers, the manufacturing as a whole for the entire process. If there were good other reasons, the optics need to be changed, right? There has to be a different conversation. There has to be a different talking point that makes it clear that this is why we would do this. This is why this would be preferred. This is why we would want to have this. I would say as it stands right now, it just feels incredibly controversial, but quite frankly, something that I don't see really benefiting anyone. It would almost be something I would say you abandon early on and revert back to a previous course.
Laura, being in education yourself, what do you think about this new tactic of taking on Harvard?
Look, Harvard has been a disaster. They're taking people from areas of the world that are very radicalized, and we don't want them making trouble in our country. They're taking $5 billion, and I'd rather see that money go to trade schools. And by the way, they're totally anti-Semitic. Harvard wants to fight. They want to show how smart they are, and they're getting their ass kicked.
I think it's incredibly controversial and it feels like a bad idea. I recognize the anti-intellectualism movement, and I can see how certainly for the president and his supporters, they see this as a great opportunity to challenge probably the most elite educational institution, not only in our country, but in the world. But many institutions of higher education look at this and they see this as truly like a shots fired moment, right? Harvard has never been challenged in this sort of way. And Harvard is not for the weak. They recognize their position in terms of academia. And so I think a lot of us in higher education are watching very carefully. I see, I mean, you can look at it in terms of the lawsuits. Harvard is certainly going to put up a fight. And it feels like this moment, perhaps a showdown of sorts between that movement in terms of anti-intellectualism, right? But then also the academic institutions that are the knowledge producers and creators of that knowledge for us, not just domestically, but internationally. It feels like that moment of a showdown. Of course, it will play out in the courts, but it's historic. It's never been done before. And it's something that I think it's just really hard to make that into a positive spin, aside from those that are already against academic institutions. I think a lot of people look at this and think it is a step too far.
Professor Laura Wilson, always value your input and your analysis of some of these big topics that affect so many people. Thank you so much for being with us on 21 Alive News again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.